Welcome everyone to tonight's talk as part of the Leave It to Beaver series. Special thanks, of course, to Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed and Larimer Conservation District for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Hopefully some of you watching this or attending this talk were able to see some of the previous speakers, some of the previous talks as part of this series. I know Ellen Wool's been a part of this, Niall Clancy. I know Emily Fairfax is coming next, and if you're looking for some great stuff, I believe a lot of those talks are recorded or will be recorded. Tonight, though, what we're going to talk about is the part of the beaver world where beavers and humans interact, where we intersect. And that, in my case, or what we're going to discuss tonight, is in the world of stream restoration. Beavers are increasingly being both promoted and used or mimicked as a part of trying to improve the health of our streams and rivers. And so what does that really mean? What does it look like to design stream restoration projects that either work with or mimic beaver? And so without further ado, my talk is titled When You Can't Leave It to Beaver, Designing Stream Restoration Projects to Mimic and Work with Nature's Engineers. Where are we going tonight? Okay, so a little bit of outlines just so you know where we're about to be. We're going to have to talk about beaver background. So maybe for some of you, this will be review. Maybe for some of you, it'll be new information. But if we're going to be in the business of promoting the sorts of changes that beavers promote naturally, and trying to do so with our own actions, we need to know why it's important. What are we expecting them to be able to do, and why does it matter to us? Next, we got to talk about degraded streams and rivers. If we're going to be in the business of restoring streams, well, we better know that we're intervening in places where the streams are in fact broken, where they are impaired. It wouldn't make much sense for us to intervene in a stream that's in good condition. So how do we recognize streams that are degraded? How do we understand how they got to be degraded in the first place? Because only by understanding those things can we make appropriate decisions about what it means to either reintroduce beaver or mimic beaver out there on the landscape. That so is going to lead us right to when we can, or why we can't, always leave it to beaver. I'm going to suggest it's not just as simple as dropping beaver off on the landscape. And if that's true, then we have to talk about what it means to design, or maybe a bit more expansively to plan or assess a project and design a project. And from there, we'll wrap up with some big picture thoughts about what it means to, how can we encourage or how can we make sure that we've got healthy riverscapes, not just, immediately after our project, but really for the really long term. In other ways, what does it mean to have a more sort of expansive vision of what it means to have riverscape stewardship? To begin, though, I just need everyone to close your eyes, or if you're watching this online, just pause the video and imagine a riverscape. So click pause now. Okay, we're back. And I'm going to show a series of photos, and I just want you to think if this photo, just kind of note whether or not one of the photos I show resembles what you pictured. And so we've got, let's see, we're starting off in the desert. We're starting off in Utah, in the mighty Colorado, outside of Moab here. Over here, we're looking at a very different stream, much smaller. There's pinyon junipers in the background. Looks like there's some sagebrush adjacent to the creek. We might start to notice some things about the creek now that we're really down on the ground. We might notice that it's got steep vertical banks, and we're not seeing a lot of riparian vegetation. We'll come back and be revisiting this particular stream a couple of times. You might have pictured something that looks like this: bigger boulders, moss everywhere, dense vegetation adjacent to the streams. If you look closely, there's even like water in the air up there, sort of your maybe a more traditional Pacific Northwest feeling. Maybe you pictured an urban stream adjacent to a roadway, anchored and stabilized by riprap going under a bridge. Maybe not the most romantic of settings, but really important nonetheless, important to consider. You might have pictured a more recreation-based environment. You can see some kayaks floating down this, what looks to be pretty challenging section of whitewater. Big boulders, steep drops, a pretty tight canyon. No really adjacent riparian areas to speak of because there's no floodplain. It's just the hill slopes come right down to the sides of the creek. You might have pictured what I think of as a sort of classic Montanan stream. big, wide open valley, kind of low gradient. You can imagine an angler here casting a fly, mountains up to the sides. Interestingly, not a lot of woody riparian vegetation, but pretty green nonetheless. For those of us on the front range, we might have pictured something like this. This is just in this neck of the woods outside of Fort Collins, really. A lot of pine, conifer, pretty messy little riverscape here, though, nonetheless. A lot of wood down there in the valley bottom. We can see some ponds being formed by the wood, it looks like. And then there's the river that we're talking about this evening, which is something that looks a little bit more like this, something that's been heavily influenced by beavers. If we were to try to walk around this zone, we'd find deep water and shallow water. There'd be some water that's just trickling over the banks. There'd be some water deep in pools, deep enough to breach your waders if you were out there, that kind of thing. I want to note, though, going back for just a moment, that beavers themselves are probably present in almost all of these systems, or at least present historically. That's not to say they would have had an equal impact on all of these systems, but it's important to note that beavers are present in a lot of places, and it's their sort of specific impact, often through their ability to build dams and or dig canals, as we'll see, that is what we're most interested in. But I want to make that clear distinction that just because beavers are present doesn't mean they're sort of the most important agent of change or riverscape health, but they are indeed often present in a lot of these places. But this is really where we're focusing this evening. Okay, beaver background. What happened? Well, to put it really, really, really quickly, there used to be a lot of beavers. They were trapped nearly to extinction. They are recovering, and they are recovering across most of the historical range, which really means most of North America. Maybe save a few places down south, on the sort of tips of Florida, really far north where they run out of the vegetation they need, and arguably some places in the Great Basin and the Mojave, although I think some of that might be subject to debate. Why did we trap them nearly to extinction? To put it sort of flippantly, hats, fashion, trapping, for sending, because their pelts have excellent felting properties and make pretty hats. If you're looking for an excellent history of this, I'd recommend the book For Fortune and Empire that tracks how North American settlement colonization was both driven by and sort of interacted with, I suppose, the trapping of beavers, as well as a couple of other animals. Okay, so that's really, really fast. If you want much more information on that, I'd recommend you go watch Ellen Wool's talk previously, part of this series. Okay, so what do beavers do? They build dams, but you already knew that. They also dig canals. You may have known that too. We should note why beavers do these things. They don't do it for us because we're excited about it. They do it to meet their own needs. And more specifically, they do it because they need to be able to safely move around the riverscape or river corridor. And I'm going to use those terms interchangeably this evening. They need deep water to move safely around the riverscape in order to get the food and dam building materials that they need to live. That also means they want deep water to have an underwater entrance to wherever they're living, whether that be a lodge out in the middle of a big pond or in a bank den. And for those of you who may have read Ben Goldfarb's excellent book, Eager, I believe he refers to them as like beavers as slow and smelly hot dogs or something to that effect, which is to say they're tasty and they happen to be pretty easy to capture when they're just waddling across land. But when you put them into the water, they're going to be able to evade predation and move much more fluidly, perhaps, as it were, across the landscape in order to be able to meet their own needs. So that's why they're doing it. And we should keep that in mind when we're in the business of mimicking them or trying to get them to persist. Okay, so they do these things, they do so much more. That's why we call them ecosystem engineers. But why are we so excited about them? What is it about beavers and their activities that has caused, such an increase in interest? Put simply, and borrowing from this excellent figure that's gotten a lot of traction, there are a lot of streams that look like the ones on the left that we want to look like the ones on the right. And we've got a lot of different ways to describe them, and we'll start doing that now, because again, this is us getting into that question of a little bit, what does a degraded stream look like, and why might we want a degraded stream to be in better condition? Okay, so why? We'll skip the kind of what for now and say, why do we want to see streams that look more like the ones on the right? Well, you might be interested in increases in aquatic habitat. There is simply more aquatic habitat on the far right than the far left. There's more water on the landscape. And that's good if you care about fish or if you care about macroinvertebrates or anything else that lives in the water. You also might notice that the quality of that habitat is much greater. It's more diverse, it's more complex, and we'll be revisiting that theme consistently this evening. There's more riparian vegetation. That's great for all sorts of reasons, both for terrestrial animals and habitats, as well as for the interaction that riparian habitat or some of the benefits riparian zones have to streams themselves. The stream on the far right is much more likely to buffer high sediment and stream flow, for example, during intense rain events or maybe even during like really high snowpack years that melt really quickly. Areas like the one on the right are going to sort of dampen or attenuate or buffer those flows of water and sediment as they come down, which in turn can reduce sediment delivery to downstream urban areas or water quality areas, water treatment facilities, and also lessening flood peaks. These areas are, won't be surprised to see, are also going to be more resilient to drought. There's simply more water on the landscape. We can store it there in a way that during those really dry years, these are areas that get to stay a little bit wetter, be a little bit more biologically productive, which is good for you whether you care about the in-stream ecology or the forage production, perhaps for domestic grazing. And lastly, these areas, and this is sort of the subject of a lot of ongoing research, may have the ability to either dampen or buffer some fire behaviors and or are less likely to burn during wildfires. There are also areas that post-wildfire can provide important, again, buffers for some of that sediment that comes after a wildfire. Okay, what did all this look like before we trapped all the beavers? It might have looked something like this. Each one of these dark spaces, I guess, that you're looking at is a beaver pond. And by the looks of it, a fairly significant beaver pond. This is the sort of landscape that we lost a lot of. And this is that landscape that looks like that previous slide, that image on the far right of that continuum. Lots of surface water, really complex, big riparian areas. This is the sort of area which, if you were to try to walk around it, would be a huge pain in the ass, frankly. You'd be stumbling, you'd be tripping, you'd be, rolling your ankle in little beaver canals. You wouldn't be able to cross the ponds without swimming. In other words, a really productive and ecologically rich area. This is what, in a lot of ways, we want to get back to where we can. Although we know, and as shown kind of in this photo, probably not everywhere. Almost guaranteedly not everywhere. But first, how do we get here? We want to know a little bit about the things that drove us into the new conditions we're in, because in order to come up with the appropriate solutions, we want to make sure we're getting as close to addressing the root causes of problems as we can. And we already talked about beaver trapping. So sometimes the root cause is something as easy as we trapped all the beavers. That's really straightforward. In other times, maybe the root cause was trapping, but we've also then piled on other sort of historic land uses that might limit our ability to get back or otherwise introduce beaver to a place. So what are some of those things? Generally, anything that changes the way that water, sediment, or wood moves through a riverscape has some impact on it. And so the usual suspects would include things like dams, which obviously store water. They change the way water and sediment move. Land use changes. I'm representing that here primarily in the form of agriculture. When we colonized and developed floodplains and river valleys, we often moved rivers around or straightened them, channelized them, removed riparian areas to put crops that we wanted. And that changes the way water and sediment moves downriver. Other land use practices, extractive practices like timber removal, like logging. We've harvested a heck of a lot of timber out of a lot of different places. Grazing, another both historic and ongoing practice that changes vegetation communities, which in turn changes the way water and sediment move down a river. It's really important to note that grazing in and of itself, and in fact some of these other practices as well, aren't inherently or aren't always going to lead to negative changes in your riverscape. However, and as shown in the photo here, when done less well, frankly, they absolutely can. But they're not always and forever leading to bad outcomes. Changes in the fire regime, most commonly via fire suppression, leading to perhaps more intense or higher magnitude fires, less frequent fires, changes the disturbance regime, changes the way water and sediment move. That's our friend Jim Bridger in the upper right, representing our beaver trappers that we already talked about. Here in Colorado, below Jim Bridger, as well as a lot of other places, we turned a lot of creeks upside down looking for gold. This is a placer mining operation that quite almost literally turned a stream upside down. And there's been some great work, including by scientists here on the Front Range, to show that the effects of this aren't just limited to when it happened, but some of those effects persist even up to today. And the final photo down in there in the bottom right shows, urbanization, or we could have added suburbanization as well, where we've built roads, bridges adjacent to our streams and forced them to be unable to behave the way they historically would have. That oftentimes means the ability to flood, get out of their banks, the ability to move around their valley bottom. At its most dramatic, it looks like this, where the whole river is put inside of a concrete canal. In a less dramatic example, you just might see really large rocks, or what we call riprap, on the outside of stream bends, and those rocks are preventing the river from moving back and forth, which is a really important process in a lot of settings. So what does an unhealthy riverscape look like? Well, it can look like a lot of things. And just like when we pictured all of those different types of rivers in our first exercise when we were imagining a riverscape, each one of those, when it's in poorer condition, looks a little bit different than a poorer condition in another setting. And some of those rivers are more resilient or less likely to change than others. This sort of science of knowing which is which and what a degraded river in the desert looks like versus a degraded river in a more temperate climate is sort of the science that, the science of riverscape experts, whether you are in the field of hydrology or riparian ecology or fluvial geomorphology. I'm just showing two examples of closer to home. These are both from Utah, my home state. What rivers look like when they're degraded. So what might we notice about some of these rivers? Well, we might notice their shape. That might be the first thing. And what do we see? Well, depending on which picture you're looking at first, you see a single thread channel. So that's something we often take for given, that a river just has one channel. But a lot of rivers have multiple channels, and especially rivers that have beavers in them. But these both just have one. It's pretty narrow. In the case of the river on the right, the stream on the right, it's got steep, vertical, unvegetated banks. So we're noticing things about the shape of the river. We could also notice things about the adjacent vegetation community. And in each case, what we'd see is a pretty low abundance of riparian species in the left, and really no riparian species in the photo on the right. Instead, we're seeing upland grasses and those sort of lighter green, smaller shrubs or sagebrush, which are, in this case, not a plant that you would expect to see adjacent to a stream if that stream is behaving as it naturally would. So we can notice things about the shape. We might notice things about the biological community, the vegetation community. If you put on your snorkel and dove down there, well, you'd still mostly be out of the water. Nonetheless, if you looked, you could look for the fish. You could look for macroinvertebrates. You could look for like the different species that live in the river, in the aquatic habitat. You, while you're down there, might notice things about what the channel bed is made up of. Is it made of sand or really fine sediment like clay? Or is it made of cobbles, baseball-sized rocks, or perhaps even volleyball-sized rocks, boulders? If you took out a few more sensors, you could note the temperature, you could know how much dissolved oxygen is in there, you could look for nutrients or pollutants. There's a whole lot of different things that you could look at. Okay. We've already, we're revisiting. I put this illustration back up to show what we're looking at and remember where we want to be and why. There were a bunch of different reasons, from increases in habitat quantity, quality, increases in riparian veg. And we talked about that. Those are all things beavers do. So the question then is all of this just as simple as quite literally dropping beavers off into these environments? And in case you're wondering, this is indeed real. These are not AI images. There have been beavers dropped from planes historically. If you haven't seen those wonderful videos, the one on the the left is still from footage that the Idaho Department of Fish and Game has. So I wholeheartedly encourage you to go look that up. Idaho Department of Fish and Game beaver parachute should do the trick. And you'll see the videos of when they dropped beavers from airplanes to help them restore headwater areas in sort of like northern Idaho back in the 1950s. The one on the right, of course, is from California. And this was a thing we did. So, close to 7 decades ago, close to 70 years. So is all of this just as simple? Should we just all go out there and trap some beavers, bring them up into the air, and push them out? And the answer, of course, is no. Please, please, no. We're not going back there, both for animal welfare reasons as well as lots of other ones. We're not going to do that. Okay. So can we leave it to beaver? Well, let's use the same figure to explore when we maybe can, when we maybe can't, and all those spaces in between. On the far left, the answer is no. We can't just leave it to beaver. We can't just drop beavers off there, certainly not out of a plane, and not even in a more humane way. Why not? Well, there's nothing for them to eat, for starters. There's not enough vegetation. Another good reason is that stream channel, the shape of that channel, just like the photo we just saw, is pretty darn narrow. This is a setting where even if they had material to build with, which they don't, those dams are less likely to persist. Doesn't mean they couldn't persist, but just less likely. And we want to give our beavers the best chance they have. We can't see it in this photo, it doesn't demonstrate it, but another time or another situation that might preclude us from just leaving it to beaver and bringing them there is adjacent land uses, competing land uses. And that could be agriculture, it could be irrigation ditches that feed agriculture in other areas, it could be urbanization, it could be suburbanization. There's a whole host of other reasons we might not be able to do this. More broadly, there could just be social concerns. There are a lot of places where, for reasons that we won't get too deeply into tonight, we might not have what we think of as the social license to operate. Maybe that's to deal with concerns about downstream water delivery. That's very real in a lot of places, Colorado certainly. Anyway, a lot of those concerns, we need to take those super seriously, because for this to be a long-term practice, it needs to be more than just those of us here who are excited about this. We need to talk to everybody. On the other side of the spectrum, the yes side of the spectrum, what do we need to have? Well, we need to have basically the opposite of all of the things on the far left. So we need to have abundant vegetation. We need to have channel and stream flow conditions that allow beaver dams to persist. Generally, though not exclusively, that usually means that we need perennial stream flow. If your stream dries up for 6 months out of the year, it's pretty unlikely beavers are going to make a go of it there. They may, and there's some really cool places that we could talk about later where that is the case. But let's just say for now that we want perennial stream flow. We also need there to be broad social support for the practice. Again, we're not going to be doing this in places where we don't have support. I put an asterisk here, though, because when we think about the long-term persistence of beaver, and that doesn't mean beavers have to be there all the time. It's different than saying that. Beavers naturally move around the landscape. But it does mean that we should take really seriously how much habitat the place we're bringing beavers to has. If we bring beavers to just a place that has abundant vegetation, perfect channel characteristics, we know it's perennial, and we have great support, but that whole project area is just a quarter mile sandwiched in between, an agricultural field and a subdivision, that quarter mile is going to be a pretty tough place to be persistent, because beavers throughout their life history are going to need to find new sources of food. They also, to be persistent, are likely going to need some fresh blood, some beavers moving into and some beavers moving out of the area. So we need to look at not just our one project site, but our project site as it relates to other adjacent areas and what the habitat quality is there, and whether or not beavers can move up and down the river corridor to other places in the watershed. I also want to highlight that the asterisk means it doesn't mean we just get to step away forever. And that's especially true because we've had such a dramatic impact on so many places throughout our watershed, and they're continuing to change in the face of climate change. Perhaps most notably in streams that were perennial, becoming intermittent. And so, yes, a lot of us want to be as hands-off as we can, and we think that once we get beaver back, we're done. But under the current, and maybe that's true in some places, it probably is. And however, let's just all note that there are going to be a lot more places where that's probably not true. And that doesn't mean when we step away, or that after we've successfully gotten beavers back to a place, that we're always back there meddling. Sometimes, not stepping away simply means checking it out. looking for signs of beaver activity and trying to get a handle on how active they are or are not. But a few qualifications I think are important there. Okay, so we've done all this. We've learned that we can't always leave it to beaver, and that means you in the audience want to act like a beaver. Sorry, I couldn't help but putting this in. That fella on the right that's a screenshot actually of a 90-second TikTok video telling you how to build a BDA. And this fella's building it in a gulch in his backyard. So you could have just gone and watched a 90-second TikTok video instead of coming to this talk. All right, but if we're going to act like beavers and we want to mimic beavers and we want to promote beavers, we have to talk about streams in different conditions. We just did a little bit of that. We also talked about what if we can get beavers back? How does that change what we do? Versus what do we do when we can't bring beavers back? And is all of this just as simple as building fake beaver dams or beaver dam analogs? So no doubt a lot of you have already known or heard of or maybe even built beaver dam analogs. But for those of you who haven't, quick review or quick introduction. A beaver dam analog simply is a hand-built structure that mimics a beaver dam. So it mimics its form in that it's made of wood and sticks, and it's intended to mimic its function. And the function of beaver dams generally is to create deep water habitat so beavers can move across the riverscape more safely and have an underwater entrance to their bank den or lodge. It has a lot of other benefits that we kind of talked about, raising water tables, forcing flows up and onto the floodplain, supporting riparian vegetation. But generally speaking, that's what a beaver dam analog is. You might have also heard the phrase or the acronym, low-tech process-based restoration, or LTPBR. These two things are often sort of spoken about close to synonymously. We're not going to dive into the bigger topic of what low-tech PBR means tonight. We're just really sticking to the beaver side of things, which is an element of it. So here are 3 images of BDAs. And right off the bat, you'll notice some similarities and some differences. Right, so what's the same? Well, they're all built of wood. That's the same. And they are all forcing an upstream pond. Those 2 things are the same in all 3 photos. Okay, so the differences, though. Most notably, you'll see that 2 of them, the ones on the right, have posts, and the one on the left does not. You might notice that they're built out of different woody material. The one on the upper right is willow. One on the lower right is conifers, and the one on the left is aspen. You also might note that the one in the upper right looks a little bit more like a basket. Looks like those willows were woven between the posts, and there's just kind of a few extra sticks on the downstream side, almost looking like afterthoughts. And that's what, if you've built structures before, you might have heard referred to as the mattress. I want to highlight that that first photo, or that upper right photo, was an earlier version of a BDA. And we slowly sort of moved from building BDAs that looked a little bit more like that, a little more like walls, to building BDAs that are much more pyramidal, much more triangular. Why? Well, lots of reasons, but let's just say 2. That's how beavers build them. And also, they tend to be more resilient to higher flows. They also just tend to introduce more woody material into your stream system, which if your dam changes, let's say, or breaches, something we'll talk about later, means there's more wood to get rearranged in ways that could force really great changes in your stream. Why aren't there any posts in the photo on the left? I can tell you the answer to that. The answer is because that place is far away from a road, and we simply weren't going to trouble ourselves or, suffer the challenge of dragging posts into a pretty remote area as well as a post bounder. And we'll talk later when we get to the specific design considerations we think about how we understand those sorts of choices. But in this case, it's as simple as that. So these are all BDAs. There are some variations, but this is what we're talking about. And so is this whole talk, is everything we've talked about in mimicking beaver and promoting beaver just as simple as building these things? And I want to say no. I want to say before we just jump into the stream and get building, there's some other things we should really think about. I want to be really clear, especially for those of you who've already jumped into the stream and done this thing, that I think it's really, 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 really unlikely that building BDAs in any situation is likely to have negative ecological impacts. I don't think that's what we're up against. And yet still, I want to suggest that there are some things we should consider before we just jump in the creek. And the way I want to do that, what I want to propose, and I'm borrowing this from an essay I read recently on regenerative agriculture, is that we think about this whole practice about mimicking beaver, and maybe we think extend it all the way to low-tech restoration or process-based restoration. And I'm going to propose this 40-40-20 rule. And so I'm going to philosophize a bit. What I mean, the first 40% of this is that we need to approach the entire problem, this entire situation, with a different mindset. We need to get okay with a few ideas that maybe traditionally have been challenging for us. The first of those is that uncertainty is okay. We can't predict the future. We often can't know the past perfectly. And that's okay. That shouldn't prevent us from taking actions. And we shouldn't try to sort of learn our way out of it before we're able to take any action. So like getting okay with not knowing some things is going to be a prerequisite for this work. That's different than saying we don't know anything. We know a lot. We know enough to take responsible action in so many places. But let's try to hold those two things in our minds at the same time. We're always going to come back to the idea that complexity or messiness is really important. So whether we talk about complexity, messiness, we could talk about spatial heterogeneity, diversity, all of those words, critical component of healthy riverscapes. I also want us to get used to the idea that rivers are movies, not photos. And that's something I heard a really well-known geomorphologist, Peter Wilcox, say several years ago. Put another way, rivers change through time. And we need to be ready for that. We need to think about rivers as dynamic, not just a static photo that, you go out there one time and you want to look like that forever, because then you'll be disappointed, I promise. Rivers are going to change, and they're going to change in ways that are broadly predictable, but not precisely predictable. With that in mind, don't get too attached. If you've built BDAs before, especially if you've only built a few of them, I bet you've gone out into the field the year after you've built, and you're coming around the river bend, and you're coming up to the BDA that you built with all your friends last year, and you just can't wait to see it. And you're really hoping it looks either just like the way it was when you left, or best case scenario, beavers have taken over and it's even bigger. And if you've built enough of these, hopefully you've had that experience. But if you've built enough of these, you've also probably had the experience where either it's not there at all, it's totally blown out and gone downstream, or it's breached, or it's filled in, it's changed in some way. And we want to accept that change and learn from that change. Or put another way, we want to get attached to the right things. We don't want to get attached to individual structures. We need to think more holistically, bigger picture, longer term. And I think the most important thing we can do when we're changing our mind here is get ready to be patient, because this is going to be a long-term commitment. Restoration isn't a one-time event, and we certainly aren't going to reverse hundreds of years of degradation in a single effort. So, strap in. We're going to be here for a while. Maybe we get lucky in the short term, but let's think about that stewardship long-term vision. Okay, so once we've changed our minds on all those things, the next big part is assessing and understanding our riverscape, our river corridor. That means we need to know why we're there. What do we have specific goals? It means we need to know what our current limiting factors are. It means we need to know how our river behaves. Are we in a really small, steep stream that doesn't see high flows? Are we in a moderate-sized stream that has, the capacity to have really large flow events during, let's say, summer thunderstorms? Or, as is the case in a lot of locations in Colorado right now, are we in a post-fire setting where both sediment and water are rushing off the hill slopes in those first years after a fire? We do need to do a really good job assessing our stream. And the reason we need to do that is not just so we can design better projects, but so that we're all talking about and seeing the same things out there on the landscape. There's a lot of room for miscommunication about what we're doing and what we expect it to achieve if we don't do a really good assessment. And then finally, the last part is designing and implementing our projects. And that's things like, where exactly are we building our beaver dam analogs? Or maybe even different types of restoration structures. How many structures do we need? This is the time when we get to, well, what exactly do they look like? How wide are they? How tall are they? What materials are they built out of? Do they use posts? Do they not use posts? But in the whole sort of lifespan of a project, that's really, I'm going to suggest, only a smaller part than changing our minds and having, and doing a good assessment. So a little bit of terminology, just so we're all talking about the same thing. I'm going to use planning and assessment to refer to sort of that initial evaluation, determining its condition, a stream's condition, what it could become in the future, and also determining what restoration approaches are appropriate and how certain we are they're appropriate. That is different than saying there's a right place or a wrong place. But this is the stage where we want to ask, like, is this a place beaver used to be? Is it a place where mimicking them is a good idea? Is it a place they could be again? And this assessment, is something we often do both behind a computer as well as in the field. It's always both. From there, we can move on to a conceptual design. And that conceptual design really is answering the question, are BDAs appropriate here? And if so, why? And what could we expect them to achieve? We don't need to get quite down into the weeds yet of exactly how many. This is just kind of higher level. Is this appropriate here? About how many structures? What might they look like? What are our objectives? And our final design, which I am also going to suggest is something that's largely a field-based activity, that's where we identify our specific locations. Where exactly are you going to put that BDA? How tall exactly is it going to be? How exactly many structures are you going to have? This can be done prior to implementation. It can be mapped or put in, flagged, or it can be completed during implementation, which frankly is the way I prefer. I think there's a lot of really good information that we get when we do this in real time, if we have experienced practitioners. I think there's a lot of confusion about who does what in this process, because the action of building BDAs, as so many people here have already experienced, can be done by a whole bunch of people, and that is really, really powerful, and it's really incredible, and we really want to support that. But sometimes it's easy to think that the thought process underneath it is equally simple, and that's not quite true. So when it comes to the planning, the assessment, the prioritizing, that's one where some formal background training is really helpful. It's hard to learn that just by work experience alone. That's where you want your scientific friends to join the conversation. That's also true for conceptual design. When you are asking whether or not this is the place to do this type of work, you want someone who understands how a river behaves and what beavers' role in it is. Because again, beavers are found across a whole wide range of riverscapes, but the specific dynamics, the specific behavior of the streams they influence is a little bit different. Maybe you're in a place where the dams blow up every other year. Maybe you're in a place where they persist for decades. How do you know the difference between those two things, and how does it influence whether or not we choose to work there? Is something that requires a solid foundation in some sort of riverscape science. When we get down to the field designs, now we're talking about a place where we can really open up and expand how many people get involved. And so, in my experience, that often means a crew or members of a crew building structures who have a single year's experience start to be able to clue in and look at the sorts of field opportunities or specific things you might see when you're walking downstream that help you identify where exactly you should put that structure. Should you put it just here or 10 feet upstream? Are you moving it upstream or downstream because, there was a big challenge to working somewhere? Maybe you have an undercut bank or there are a lot of boulders in the creek. Or are you just moving it because if you bump this structure a little bit upstream, that it'll be in the, you'll be forming a backwater that extends exactly where you want it to be. Or you want to force flows over a bank and you're just simply picking a place that has, a lower bank. There's a lot of different things we look at, and we'll talk about those guidelines, but this is something that can be learned on the job. When it comes to implementation, I think as so many people here are evidence of, a lot of people can do this. You can learn this really effectively on the job. You get better at it with time. You can build safely and more efficiently with experience. But this is something that just about anybody can do. And then we come down to the very bottom one, because remember, we're in this for the long term, and I can't stress that enough. And if we're in it for the long term, it's really important that we know how to communicate about what we're doing, because we're going to have to keep explaining to people why we keep going back to the same place over and over. And I do want to suggest that that's not a bad thing. We need to change our minds that going back somehow represents a failure. We'll talk more about that. But if we're going to do that adaptive management and talk about it, that's really benefits from both having sort of a big, broad understanding about how rivers behave and why, and experience doing the job. So to put a little bit of a finer point on this, and don't read these too hard, it's not the point. You can pause the video if you'd like, though. Field design and implementation is really the tip of an iceberg. Most of the iceberg, though, as we know, is underwater. And that's where we're asking all of these different questions about how our river behaves, what the potential future condition can be, how this practice of mimicking beaver is likely to get there. What are some of the things we don't know that we need to learn as we do, learn by doing? Um, Lots of different questions. And again, field design, just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so design itself. I think there are multiple right ways to do this. There's not a single right way. I think there are ways that are more efficient and less efficient, but there's not only one way to do this. It's also important to know that your final design is a reflection of both your assessment as it pertains to your riverscape behavior and the condition you're in and the condition you want it to be in, as well as simple things like logistics. And by logistics, that might mean how much material you have available, what kind of access routes are there, how much money do you have for your project. Put simply, if you have $10,000 to do a project, you're going to have a very different final design than if you have $100,000. And that doesn't mean one is better or worse, one is right or wrong. It's just acknowledging that both of these variables influence what we actually do out on the landscape. Another thing that really influences what we do out there on the landscape is how the whole process fits together. So if you are a group and you have the good fortune of doing both the assessment and the conceptual design and the implementation, you might do design like I'm doing it in that photo on the right, where once we understand our site, we just go out there in real time and we identify places in the field and we're off to the races. And that's because we know the people doing the work understand what we're doing and we're confident that we can make those field-based decisions. Alternatively, you might be responsible for doing a design that you're going to pass off to somebody else. And if you're going to pass it off to somebody else, you might need to give them a lot more detail. And that's what's shown in the design on the left. And that's a real design from a recently proposed project where the very specific locations have been chosen and the specific heights and widths of structures and the number of posts needed have also been identified. But that's only being done because the person who did the design in this case isn't also doing the implementation. Throughout all of this, though, we should always go back to what is our sort of like gold standard? It's beavers. So what do beavers do for design? And luckily, we know the answer to that question. It's this. It's not this. Of course it's not this. This is a screenshot, however, of a wonderful film called Hundreds of Beavers, which I highly recommend. Well worth it. No, beavers do not this. They're not out there with a construction crew having pre-flagged their structures with the surveyors and construction oversight. It's not that. So I do think it's important to always kind of zoom back out, pull ourselves back out and ask, if we're really mimicking beaver, what's the most important thing we can do? And I'm going to suggest that it's not very precise designs necessarily. And so a colleague of mine recently said, in response to some questions in the conversation we were having, what if this? Is beaver mimicry really the construction of really nice packed-in dams, or is it returning repeatedly with a thoughtful eye, understanding, and a long-term commitment to fostering resilient riverscapes? And I want to be super clear. We can build really great dams. We're so good at it. Not just the concrete variety, but also the woody variety. What we have been struggling with for lots of different reasons, and maybe we'll talk about these afterwards, is coming back. Is whether you think of that as stewardship or maintenance, doesn't matter to me, but it's returning. Beaver mimicry, the thing that makes beavers really special, is not just the dams they build, but the fact that they're constantly there, tinkering, maintaining them. And so when we are in the business of mimicking beaver, let's keep our eyes on that. Let's focus on what really matters. And it's that long-term engagement, that long-term commitment. Okay, but you might be asking, Scott, that's a lot of sort of like big, airy, abstract concepts. I really just need to know, where do we put these things? I'm at the creek. What should I be looking at? All right, well, it's going to be different everywhere, but let's give some basic considerations. Okay, so it's going to be related back to the place you are and your objectives in that place. So if you're building to create beaver habitat, you're going to want to build bigger structures that form deeper, bigger pools. Because as we know, the reason beavers build those bigger dams to force those more extensive ponded areas is to be safe when they move around the landscape and have an underwater entrance to their lodge. That's what we're seeing in that upper right-hand photo. So that's a BDA that we built just last year, and we built it in a place that backs up into willows, so a food source and a dam building source. That's a great location for it. What if you're just building for channel floodplain connectivity? You want to get flows over the bank, maybe raise the groundwater locally, support expansion in riparian vegetation. Well, if that's the case, just build to the top of the bank. And it doesn't really matter whether the top of the bank is 1 foot tall or 4 feet tall. You're going to be able to achieve that objective by building to the top of the bank. So you just, that's what you look for. What if you're building to trap sediment capture? Well, in that case, just about anywhere is going to work. That said, places with a lower gradient, with a lower slope, are going to have the capacity to trap more sediment than other places. Places where you can force flows over bank, where sediment can get deposited over bank, are also going to have the ability to trap more sediment. And what about if you're building structures to help recover a structure that's been incised? So kind of think back to that first diagram we saw with that incised and narrow stream channel. Well, in that case, we might want both widening of the channel, erosion of the banks, as well as capturing sediment. And if that's what we want, we can build just about anywhere, including in meander bends. Because again, in that case, erosion of that outside bend is actually a necessary change for the long-term recovery. And so to look at these two photos, we see just two examples of that. In the top one, we get both that deep water habitat for beaver and increases in channel floodplain connectivity. So that meets two objectives. And in the lower one, we still are meeting the objective of lateral connectivity, but we're not really building the deep water habitat for beaver. It's just not deep enough. Sure, it's okay, but it's not the kind of place where a beaver is probably going to be able to build a bank den or a lodge, and it doesn't back up into adjacent willow stands, so it's not the place they really need. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to learn before doing versus learn by doing. Because we are engaged in so many, historically stream restoration practices where we learned a lot before doing. And so in the photo on the left, you can see this is post-restoration. A brand new channel has been just carved whole cloth. There's no vegetation left. They just started from scratch. And if you're going to start from scratch and you're going to build something and you want that something to persist, or alternatively, if there are really severe consequences to making sure you build the right thing, there are a lot of things you are going to want to know ahead of time because you have to make so many decisions. You have to decide how deep is the channel? How wide is the channel? How sinuous should the channel be? Should the channel have, what angle should the banks be? Should there be wood jams in it? Should the channel bottom be composed of big rocks, small rocks, a mix of those two things? Should you have pools? If so, how many? Should you have riffles? How many? There's so many choices you have to make. And if the consequences of getting it wrong, you really need to know, you need to make sure that you're answering those questions correctly. Or alternatively, even if the consequences aren't great, if there are going to be repercussions from not doing it right because folks won't be real happy that you built a new channel that totally changed the next year, well, then you have to answer a lot of questions. In other words, that's a learn before doing scenario. If you want to learn by doing, which I think is really appropriate for what we do, we get to sidestep a lot of those questions. That doesn't mean we don't do an assessment. We absolutely still do. But we can handle a lot more uncertainty. There we are again. There's a lot of things that we don't need to know. We don't need to know if this structure will blow out or not next year, because the reality is under some flow conditions it will, and under some flow conditions it won't. We also don't need to know exactly how much sediment moves down this stream. And we don't need to know a lot of these things because we're okay with uncertainty. We know that diversity is really important. We know things change through time anyway. We're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of thinking that goes into that, that bottom of the iceberg. But rather than knowing everything ahead of time, we can often just pose the question and be committed to learning it through time to help us do better work as we proceed. Because remember, we're here for the long term. So what does it mean to design in the face of this uncertainty and for learning? Because I'm going to suggest that those are actually kind of two of the key elements or two of the key things we should think about when we're designing low-tech projects. So what decisions can we make to address uncertainty, both about the past, so what conditions used to be here, the present, for example, how much sediment delivery does this river have, or the future, what are flow conditions likely to be in the long term, or maybe just next year? And how can we design projects that maximize our ability to learn so that we can continually learn from and adapt our restoration practices to make them more effective? I just want to give a few guidelines on this one. The first thing I think we can do is diversify. This helps us both learn and address things that we don't know. There's no Goldilocks BDA. There's no one correct size for any type of structure. Why? Well, we're operating in different settings, and different structures might be influential at different flows. A structure that might be really, really great at forcing overbank flows and really deep pond during one flow condition might be more likely to blow out during a higher flow condition because it's bigger, because it's storing so much more water, so much more energy. Alternatively, a structure that's the same height but can access its floodplain is going to behave differently than a structure of that height where it's in a really deep incised trench. So there's no one right structure. Instead, let's diversify and just say we want a little bit of everything. That may mean different structure sizes or even types, which is not something we're going to cover today. But if you've heard of something called a post-assisted log structure or a PAL, it might be a time when we start integrating different structure types like that. Or if we're working in places with rocks, maybe the sort of suite of structures that's popularly known as Z-dike structures. In either case, though, thinking about the diversity of structure types is our sort of hedge. It's our kind of insurance against or for the things that we don't know. Next year's snowpack, current limitations, whatever it may be. And so I'm going to suggest we should think of the range or the distribution of structure sizes. Specifically, don't do everything the same. That allows us to address both learning and uncertainty. And if, again, we want to ask, how is this rooted in a broader understanding? Let's always go back to what the beavers do. What would beavers do? Are all beaver dams the same? The answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that they, when built, form ponds. Certainly a no, though, in the sense that they vary wildly in shapes and sizes. Some of them are really straight across the channel. Some of them look like S-curves. Some of them are oriented convex upstream, convex downstream. Some of them are a foot tall. Some of them are 8 feet tall. And so that diversity is something that we always are keeping our eye on as well. And so the image on the right, that's just a hypothetical that shows that what that might look like on any given reach, in any given project. Maybe you build 20% of your structure shorter, 20% of them taller, and 60% somewhere in the middle. Shorter ones are going to be lower risk, less likely to blow out, most likely because they store less water, have less energy forced up against them. Lower effort, they simply need fewer materials, but also lower reward. They aren't going to be able to capture as much sediment. They aren't forming as deep a pond, and they're less likely to get flows over bank. By contrast, the taller ones, higher risk in the sense that with that bigger pond, more energy behind it, more likely to blow out, takes more time to build, also has a higher potential reward, but may be more vulnerable. And somewhere in between those, we have a compromise. We'll learn about which ones are most effective for what flow conditions by building all of them. So think of distributions, not Goldilocks. And that leads us to a couple of other questions before we get to our sort of final case study, which is if we look at this same continuum again, we look and we ask, what's different when we go to each of one of these places? Well, we know some of the things that are different. The stream side, the stream channel itself is different. How much water is different. How much riparian vegetation is there is all different. But the question I want to pose is, do our structures change across these 4 settings? Or is it the location of where we choose to put them that changes? Or is it really a mindset thing? Is what we want those structures to do the thing that primarily changes? Because in each of these settings, we can build BDAs. And in a lot of ways, BDAs are appropriate in each of these settings, maybe with the exception of the one on the far right, where the beavers are already off and doing their thing. But in the other cases, we're still building BDAs. We're still dragging sticks and we're still dragging mud. The locations might change slightly. We might be more or less willing to work on the outside of meander bends if we're hoping to see channel widening as part of our responses. But in general, it's not all that different. And so I want to come back to this idea that it's a mindset, that it's really what we want those sticks, what we want those BDAs, what we want those beaver dams to do that often is the biggest change. All right, but let's make it real. Let's go just upstream to a tributary to the South Fork Poudre, just west of Fort Collins. And truly, the stream is called Beaver Creek. For those of you familiar with this is not the same location that some ongoing work is actually taking place on. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. I want you to take my word for it that I've done the assessment already, and our current condition is the one that I'm showing in the top panel. It's not really incised anymore, but it's single thread. There's some riparian vegetation. There used to be beaver dams here, but they're not here anymore. And I am telling you that beaver dams are present, but not on the project site itself. They're about 2 miles upstream. There's moderate riparian veg. The banks in this location happen to be ranged from about 2 to 5 feet tall. The full project area is about 2 miles long, and it's about 120 feet of total drop, of total relief across our project. All right, that's our setting. What are we going to do? All right, first thing we're going to do, ooh, yikes. We're going to come up with a conceptual design. That's on the left. And my conceptual design for this, and I thought about having everyone do this ahead of time, but decided against it, is I'm going to say that about 40 to 60 BDAs are appropriate over about the 2 miles. Why is that the case? Well, pretty straightforward geometry problem. If you build 60 BDAs that are 2 feet tall, 60 times 2 is 120, and we have 120 feet of total relief, so 62-foot BDAs conceptually is how you could convert that full reach into a backwater or a pond to a pond to a pond all the way up. Alternatively, you could build 40 BDAs that are 3 feet tall, or 30 BDAs that are 4 feet tall, or I suppose 2 BDAs that are 60 feet tall. So that's where that comes from. Not terribly complicated, just a rough ballpark. We're just conceptual at this stage. And because I know that there are beavers upstream, I want to build about half of them, 20 to 30, in places that can form the biggest pond possible. That means both the deepest and areally most extensive. And I want those ponds, those particular ponds, those really bigger ones, to back up into places that have abundant riparian vegetation that beaver need to eat and harvest dam building material for. Because I'm really hoping that some juvenile or dispersing beaver is going to stumble down, find one of our BDAs, and think, this is a good place. And what do we know beavers need? Well, we know they need deep water, and we know that they need food and forage. So if we can create those conditions, that's great. I'm not going to say that this dam is going to attract a beaver. It's not like dams are magnets that pull beavers in, but we are creating the conditions we know beavers need, and that's great. Those dams are going to take a longer time to build because we're going to be specifically looking for places where we can build bigger and deeper. So we're looking for places maybe that have deeper channel banks, and we'll get to that in field design, I suppose. I also want some structures, though, that we don't need every structure to be that big. And so I want 20 to 30 that are just in areas that increase the ability for flows to get up and out of the channel, increase our channel floodplain connectivity during both high flows and low flow conditions. And so those could be places where the banks are just 2 feet tall. Anywhere we've had banks that are that small, we can build a dam that forces water up and out of the banks. Those may or may not be in places that back water up into really extensive willow stands, but increasing the water table, getting flows up and over the banks, create the conditions that allow more riparian vegetation to grow. And so that's still going to be really critical to the long-term health of this. Right, so that's our conceptual design. About 40 to 60, all BDAs, and we're kind of mapping out some of the design guidelines. When we actually get out there in the field, that means we have to look for several things. We're going to look for opportunities for big ponds. That means taller banks, wider channels. Those are the places where we can build that big dam that the beavers really need to meet their needs. We're also going to be looking for those places where we don't have tall banks, where we just want to get the flows up and out. And so that means places with, just simply put, smaller banks. What are we going to avoid? Well, we're going to avoid places where this is a place where we don't want to be building on the outside of meander bends because those dams are simply more likely to end cut. That's the river telling us, I want to move over there, and I'm probably going to keep moving over there regardless of what you do. And so if we want to build dams to create deep water for beaver or get flows over bank, building on the outside of those dams isn't terribly useful. The last thing we want to do, and something I think is best achieved in the field, is that during implementation, we want to locate our dams close enough that the pond habit backs one up to the other. In other words, that it's contiguous. And so we might site our really big dam, and we're super excited about it, and you might ask, well, where's the next dam going to go? Well, it can be just as simple as walking upstream, seeing where the sort of just tippity top of your pond is, and siting another dam right about there. You might choose to put it a little bit more into the existing pond. That's something you could do. Or it could be right where that pond ends, or even a few feet upstream. But generally speaking, we want to create habitat that makes it easier for beaver to move around. And there it is. We've done it. We have done our conceptual design. We did our assessment, conceptual design, and then when we got out there in the field, we knew what to look for and cited things appropriately. That's all great. High fives all around. We go back home. A year passes. And we are super excited to get back out to our restoration project and just waiting for the snow to melt. And we get out there the next year. And oh no. Oh dear. Oh damn, as it were. And this has happened. Or at least it's happened some places. Maybe. I don't know. Anything could have happened. In fact, all of these probably could have happened in the same year. Or different years. The point is there's going to be a lot of possible outcomes. And so here I am in the bottom of a creek bed, looking at an old structure that was built. And so what are some of the options here? Well, you might come back and see that some of your dams have breached. Some material's gone downstream. You might come back and find your dams are full of sediment. You might come back and find that all of your dams have blown out, but it was a really high flow last year. Oh well. You might find out that it wasn't a really high flow last year, kind of like this year's, but still a lot of dams blew out. Maybe your dams are intact, but they're no longer ponding. Maybe you got lucky and the beavers moved in and they built your dams taller and wider. Maybe your dams look just exactly the same as the day you left them. All of these are possibilities that can happen, and indeed probably will happen if you keep going back long enough. So what do we do? Relax, take a breath. It's going to be fine. Go back to the assessment. We want to remember, this is why we did that assessment in the first place. What did we expect? What didn't we know? And also, really importantly, what are we learning? Are we learning about our system? Are we learning about things that we knew we didn't know ahead of time? Are we learning something about whether or not this approach is effective in this place? Are we learning something about the site's limitations, potential future conditions, or its trajectory? All of these are the things that are going to start going through our mind. Because we want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. Because we need to know why so we can make better decisions going forward. And so I'm showing this photo, and for those of you who were here in 2013, you were here when the Poudre River flooded. And this actually happened the first week of school for me, when we were young, bright-eyed, and bushy-tailed, and classes were canceled. And it's quite a thing when your fluvial geomorphology class is canceled that you get to go ride your bicycle out to the Poudre, which is like 5 times as wide as it normally is. But I put this photo up here to show an example of something that I've seen happen a couple times, and never quite on this scale. But people showing a photo like this and saying to me, look at this incredible amount of channel floodplain connectivity. Isn't it incredible that our restoration forced this degree of connectivity? And I think that's not the lesson here. I know. You're identifying what happened accurately. There is a lot of flooding. But you're not getting the why right. The why isn't it happened because you built BDAs. The why is because you had a 500-year precipitation event. And so when we go back out and we analyze our structures or we assess them, that's where we want to bring in both some deep thinking and formal expertise as well as experience so that we can make better better decisions going forward. Again, we're in this for the long haul, so that learning element is really, really critical. And I want to highlight that with just 2 final images here. The first, is to remind us that rivers are movies, not photos. Rivers, especially those that are influenced by beavers, change through time. How do we design for that? How do we know when to intervene? And so this time series shows a small stream in southern Wyoming, and it shows it from 1947 on the left all the way to 2021 on the right. The time steps are irregular. It just happens to be the aerial imagery that's available. What I've done for each of these is delineate the beaver ponds in blue for each of these photos. And what you see is that back in 1947, close to 80 years ago, there were just a few dams. They slowly increased. It looks like they hit their maximum kind of in the 80s, 90s maybe. And they've been decreasing since then. The question, though, that this should raise is, are beavers just about to take off again? Or is the lack of ponds shown in 2021 showing us something that suggests we should intervene, that it's actually in poorer condition? And I'm not going to answer that question right now, but I want us to always keep in mind that things change naturally through time. And it's important to do this kind of background learning, this background assessment, to know when we should step in. I want to show another one. This is actually from my hometown of Logan, Utah. This creek is called Spawn Creek, just upstream. Well, just upstream from town, I suppose. And here I'm showing 3 different time steps, all within the last 20 years. And I'm showing, this case, I haven't delineated the ponds themselves, just the dam crests. And what you see is a really dramatic increase in the number of dams. And if you're looking, you can obviously see some pretty extensive ponding. The question for us, though, is then how are these going to continue to change through time? And is one of these conditions better or worse than another? Or do they all simply fit into the sort of longer term vision of what riverscapes should look like when they're influenced by beaver? I think I have one more thing to show you here. I just want to highlight same photos, same dam crests. In this case, what I did is I'm showing the current dam crests on the old imagery, just so I can draw your attention to something. If you focus on the rectangle, what you see is a big old aspen stand. And you'll notice that that big old aspen stand is very present and alive and doing well in 2006. It's starting to get a little mowed down in 2014, and by the 2023 imagery, it is gone. In other words, all the wood that was in that aspen forest got, not translated, but converted to beaver dams. And that should make us think, oh, what comes next? If the wood source and the forage source that the beavers used in this setting to build their dams is now depleted by their own doing, what does the future look like? It might look like beavers will be here for a while, but maybe they move on until that aspen stand regenerates. Again, so we're always keeping our eye on the idea that streams are dynamic and they change through time. And where that leads us, I think, the very end, is to this question, which is what do we need to do in order to have healthy riverscapes in 2126? And whether you want to think of this as 100 years from now or as, ensuring that 7 generations from now we've got healthy riverscapes, doesn't matter to me. What does matter is that we are thinking over these timescales. This puts us admittedly at odds with a lot of the current funding mechanisms we currently have or regulatory policies and permitting that we need to acknowledge when we do this work. But we as people concerned, we as practitioners or just volunteers, citizens, scientists, everybody really, this needs to be, I think, the motivating question. And if we keep our eye on this, I think we're going to see a couple different things. One is we'll start realizing that beaver mimicry and beaver projects in general aren't about just building well-packed dams and coming up with very precise designs. But instead, they're about coming back. It's about long-term commitment. It's about stewardship for a really long time. It's about learning as we go. It's about designing our projects in a way that accepts that we don't know everything, but we're committed to learning about it through time. It also means facing some other, admittedly, bigger picture topics head on. And that can mean things like how do we start advocating for different funding mechanisms that aren't limited to the one and done approach. It means we need to change some minds about what it means, what failure means. And that going back through time doesn't represent failure, it just represents the natural state of affairs and how we should approach this work. It also means that we should take really seriously the people who are engaged in this work. One of the great strengths of this work is that it can involve a ton of people, volunteer groups, student groups, you name it. But if we want to get a lot of this done and we don't want to go back year after year, we're going to need jobs for people to do this work. And we're going to need those jobs to be good jobs, not just, low-paying seasonal gigs where people do it for 3 months and move on. If we're really going to take the long-term health of riverscapes seriously, we need to take the long-term health of the people working in those riverscapes seriously as well. And that means rethinking some pretty big picture economic questions. So in short, we're going to need a lot more patience, a lot more humility when we're out there, and a lot more commitment to the long term. And we need to realize, to bring it back to design, that the decisions we make in 2026 this year, I would suggest are only going to explain, 1% of the riverscape health in 21-26. And what explains that other 99% is all of these other things. It's making sure we're going back. It's being committed to both the riverscapes and each other so that we can make these places healthy, not just now, but for the long term. With that, I would just like to say thank you so much. And if you've got questions, feel free to reach out. Cheers.